Back when I was in the Royal Navy, there was a swimming test that everybody had to do, which finished with you having to climb up the 10-meter board, so 30 feet, and jump off. So you had swam, you'd floated, you'd picked up objects off the bottom of the pool, all dressed in a heavy cotton boiler suit, and then you had to climb up these steps all the way to the top. And then when you got to the top, and you'll know if ever you've stood on a 10-meter board, that it's very high and it's a long way down. But you had to jump. Having done everything else, if you wanted to pass the test, you had to jump. Now, I did, and it wasn't a problem, but it was interesting, the number that didn't. And for them, the frustration was that they not only did they have to face jumping off the board again, but they had to do all the swimming and floating and picking things up, etc., etc. And it's interesting, as I reflect back over that, I see it as a sort of a real lesson for life. Because what we see is, in some ways, it represents, or it's symbolic of times in life when we have to, in the midst of all that's going on around us, we have to stay focused and take that step off what we know and into the somewhat unknown. Now, those who didn't jump, I often wondered what held them back. Now, today, we're not likely to be asked to jump off a 10-meter diving board, but we all will face situations, we may be facing them now, where we need to stay focused and we need to take that step, as it were, off what is familiar and safe and out into the unknown. And as we consider our gospel reading for today, that very familiar account of Peter walking on the water, so we see how this encounter of Peter's helps us as we see him stepping out of the boat. And it helps us to think, what do we need to do? What's important for us as we face those life situations where we are called to step away from the familiar and into the unknown, where we are called to trust God, perhaps just that little bit more. And as we think about this sort of recording of Peter doing that, well, I just want to sort of draw out a number of things that help us to think about how we can respond as we sort of are called to do something similar. And I guess the first thing, before we look at the four things, the first thing that it raises in our minds is, what, when we face those difficult situations, what are those things within us that might keep us from getting out of the boat? Just like the guys who didn't jump off the board, what are those things that hold us back, as it were? So Peter and his experience, four things. I think it's four. The first thing we see is that we need to be able to recognize Jesus when he comes to us. If we picture the scene of the disciples in the boat, they're halfway across the lake and they're caught up in this storm. Things are going on around them. They are not unfamiliar with these things, and they're things that they need to be doing, whether that's straining on the oars, whether that's making sure the sail is down. There's things that they need to be dealing with, and rightly so, within all that's going on. And they're doing that. And then Jesus comes to them walking on the water. But because he comes to them in a way that they're not expecting, rather than seeing Jesus, they actually say, it must be a ghost. And so initially, they fail to recognize Christ coming to them until he speaks to them. And we see Jesus reassure them, don't be afraid, it is I, he says. And what's interesting is what we see Jesus, the words we see Jesus using here are the words that God used when he speaks to Moses at the burning bush. I am, God says to Moses. And Jesus says the same to the disciples. Take courage, don't be afraid, I am. I wonder, in the midst of all of our life's ups and downs, all of the things that we need to be dealing with in the midst of that, I wonder, do we sometimes fail to recognize Jesus when he comes to us? Because he comes to us in a way that perhaps we're not anticipating or expecting. Through a neighbor, through a friend who calls. Peter's encounter reminded him, and it reminds us, that we need to be open to recognizing the risen Christ, the person of Jesus, as he comes to us and speaks to us in the midst of, those storms in life. And we need to hear him saying to us, take courage, don't be afraid, I am. The next thing that we see, a lesson that we learn from Peter, it's the challenge to us, are we willing to take the risk and to respond when Jesus calls us or invites us? Peter says to Jesus, if it's you, then just say the word. Tell me, invite me to step off the familiar and into the unknown. And Jesus says simply, come. The invitation is offered, and the rest is up to us. Peter had the choice. He could have gone, no, not sure, and stayed in the boat. But he stepped out. He responded to the invitation. I wonder what might have been going through your mind if you were in Peter's shoes at that moment. Stepping into the unfamiliar, the unknown. We need to remember that at that point, when Jesus says, come, the storm is still raging. His surrounding circumstances haven't changed. But because Peter is obedient, his perspective of the surrounding circumstances changes. He's able to see and to deal with the storm in a different way, if that makes sense. We need to respond when Jesus calls us, even if he asks us to do what might seem to be impossible. And then the third thing, we need to keep our focus fully upon Jesus, even when everything around us appears to be in chaos. There's Peter walking on the water. But then he allows his focus to drift away from Jesus and towards the storm. He looks around and he becomes overwhelmed by the storm, and he loses sight, as it were, of Jesus, the one who is holding him up. And we're told that he was afraid, and he begins to sink. And we've all felt like that in life, I'm sure, that we're just slowly sinking. Peter allows himself to be distracted by his present circumstances, seeing them through his own eyes, as it were, rather than through the eyes of God. And Jesus gives him a gentle rebuke. Why did you doubt? Where is your faith? And you know, for us today, as we look around us, how easy it is for us to do the same. To take our eyes off Jesus, to doubt what God has promised, to lose heart, maybe to lose faith that God is able. How easy it can be, like Peter, to allow the surrounding, the seemingly impossible circumstances that we face crowd in and distract us. And we hear spoken to ourselves that faint echo. Why do you doubt? Where is your faith? Peter's experience reminds us that Jesus doesn't say to us, trust me and obey me, when your world is all nicely ordered and stacked neatly, when you're in control of everything that's going on. Jesus says, trust me, obey me, whatever is going on, whatever the state of your sort of situation and circumstances at that moment. Trust me. Because as you do, Jesus says, so I will work both for you and through you. Thankfully, today, we're not being asked to step off a 10-meter diving board, nor are we being asked to step out of a boat and walk on water, although at times it might feel like that. But we are being asked to trust God, whatever the circumstances are that we're facing. We're being asked to know him, to see him coming to us in the unexpected and the unfamiliar. We're called to listen to his voice and to keep our focus upon him, so that our surrounding circumstances are viewed in a right perspective, however wind-blown and turbulent they might appear. And we're called to know that as we keep our eyes on him, so he will hold us up. Amen.